Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Dr. Peter Pritchard, who heads a research institute specializing in turtles and tortoises, and he's one of the leading experts in this field in the world. Welcome, Dr. Pritchard.
Thank you very much, John.
Tell us a little bit about how you came into the study of turtles and tortoises.
I grew up in Ireland where there are no turtles or tortoises, and I was a sort of perverse-minded kid. I couldn't find anyone interested in them, but somehow they interested me. And it was almost impossible to find books about them either. Nowadays, you're overwhelmed with books in the field, but I think it was just my own sort of cussedness that made me pursue something that was a very unlikely thing for the place in which I found myself.
Well, when did you have your first turtle experience?
Probably when my grandparents took me to the London Zoo, and I didn't even know there were such things before, and somehow they caught my attention even then. And I really enjoyed them as a child. But then I got sort of displaced into chemistry and did that for my undergraduate degree. But then I thought, no, this isn't really where I want to be. There's no human side to it. And the biologists I knew at Oxford had a wonderfully human side to their studies, and they had wonderful stories to tell of things they had found in darkest Africa and brought back. And I thought, hey, that's fun. That's exciting. We should do that.
So what was your first hands-on experience in a sort of biologist role vis-a-vis turtles and tortoises?
Well, as an undergraduate in England, I simply read about them as best I could. We had the Oxford Library, and they had sort of wonderful tomes from 300 years ago with wonderful illustrations about turtles. But I went to the University of Florida to study under the famous Dr. Archie Carr, and from that point on I was doing field work every year that would bring me in contact with turtles in the wild.
Now you went from an interest in this that developed as a young person into the formal study of the subject, and now you head, I'm guessing, the largest private institute devoted to turtle and tortoise research. Is that correct?
I believe it is, yes. We're the third biggest, including official governmental institutes. Smithsonian are bigger than us, Carnegie Museum is bigger than us, but we have more than all the European museums, for example. There are only those two ahead of us in terms of simply a specimen count. I think we may also be up right up top, or very close to the top, in diversity of species. We have every genus and nearly all the species in the collection.
So now you have the largest private institute dealing with this subject. You're globally known as a turtle and tortoise conservationist and as an environmental conservationist in a broader sense. You've been designated a hero of the planet by Time magazine. How does that make you feel?
Well, I told you what my son said, didn't I? He said, "Which planet?" He couldn't conceive of any normal planet that would have me as a hero of it.
The children never fully understand what their parents do.
That's probably true, yeah.
But so, hero of the planet, and you delve into lots of other environmental areas as part of your work, even though the turtle and tortoise piece is the core. But where have your travels taken you?
Well, they've taken me to 80 or 90 countries and territories. I keep going back to Guyana and the Galapagos Islands. I have ongoing operations there. I've worked in Costa Rica recently, and indeed in the past as well. I've worked in Honduras. I've worked quite a bit in Mexico. I've worked somewhat in Madagascar and Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand.
Now, the Guyana Experience is unique and has an interesting story behind it. Tell us a little bit about how that developed.
It started in 1964, I guess, when I went to Guyana, or British Guyana as it was then, and heard rumors of turtles nesting in the northwest and went out to see what was happening. Very difficult to get to, but I finally managed to reach it, and there were slaughtered turtles everywhere. And I thought, this is wrong. We've got to pass some laws to make this illegal and have vigilantes to stop people killing the turtles. And then I met the people who were killing them, who were Arawak Indians, indigenous people, very courteous, very pleasant. In no way were they like dangerous poachers. They were like people out to get some food for their family. So I realized this mustn't be confrontational, because that's just going to, I will lose. I'll leave the country and they'll say, thank God he's gone. But I decided to make friends with them and promised to raise some modest amount of money for a salary for them if they would ostensibly work for me, but really working for themselves in turtle preservation and protection and patrolling the beaches and making sure that their own colleagues are very politely deflected from killing the nesting turtles too.
And that was initially successful, or did it take a period of time for something to happen?
Well, we couldn't be everywhere at once, but we tried to be, and these are the most shifting beaches in the world. We have to resurvey every year to figure out where our base camp's going to be. But we worked in the village as well, and we did some presentations in the village, and then we thought of bringing the youngsters out, because the youngsters there have never been to the turtle beach. They know a lot about nature because they're living in it every day. They go to school in little dugout canoes with little paddles. They're very close to nature. But we bring them out, and we still do it now. This is that rare word, sustainability. We are about the most sustainable or sustained conservation program I know of in South America, or maybe beyond that. So we bring the youngsters out and we show them the turtles nesting, and it's very hard not to be impressed by sitting beside a 300 or 400 pound turtle that is simply nesting, and it's not afraid of you, it's not trying to hurt you, it's not trying to run away, it's just you and the turtle and the stars. It's a very memorable experience, especially the first time.
Now, I think the importance of that work in the context of Guyana and the particular group you're working with, I think is easy to grasp. But what does this mean for people who are watching our show today, who are probably far removed from Guyana and not necessarily familiar with the impact of this work?
Well, it's a big question. In other words, how can they get involved, you might say?
Or what does it mean that you're preserving the turtles there?
Well, turtles, fortunately, are not sort of ambivalent in the same way that sharks or crocodiles and things like that are, where some people say, get rid of them all, and other people say, no, I like them. Nobody really dislikes turtles. So the point we made in our discussions with the erstwhile turtle hunters were, look, we have a very major thing in common. We both want there to be turtles tomorrow, because I like turtles. It's a perfectly selfish little thing, but I like turtles. I think they're wonderful, and I want other people to enjoy them and so on. We want them to play their role in the ecosystem, but we mustn't be ashamed of the emotion of loving them. And that's what we try to get the kids to do, not only to understand their biology, but to really feel towards them. And the other side is not necessarily doing turtles for that reason, but if they want to go on hunting turtles, they have to have some kind of management plan that involves conservation, or they'll go down to zero and have to do something else.
So talk to us a little bit about a very special tortoise, Lonesome George. This is a tortoise that has become famous worldwide, and you've been significantly involved in his life for the duration. You've written about this, books, monographs, and so forth, and you have a BBC4 documentary called Lonesome George and the Battle for Galapagos, that audiences are seeing in various locations around the country. So tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, George was George is the only surviving Pinter Island giant tortoise. And it's a very distinctive kind of tortoise. It has a sort of strange Quasimodo-like hump and a very tall stance and a sort of white face. it looks different from other Galapagos tortoises. They were thought to have disappeared by about the end of the 1800s, but just a few individuals were found in the early 1900s, just one or two at a time. Lord Rothschild was very crazy about Pinter tortoises, and he would send expeditions out to get some for him. But when this one was found by accident in 1972, it was the first one for 60 years or more.
And how old was it at this point, roughly?
It was a young adult male, so it was probably 40 years old, 45 years old. Galapagos tortoises can easily live over 100 years if nothing goes wrong. And then, we continued to search the island. I was there myself with quite a team of very athletic goat hunters and so on 3 or 4 years ago. And all we found were skeletons. And not only did we only find skeletons, we only found skeletons of males. So some weird stuff had been happening to that population in its last years. And not only did it go extinct, it went extinct through these two odd causes. They're all male now, and they're all falling into potholes until the last one is gone. So now we've still got Lonesome George. He's in good health. He's in captivity, and he's got a private keeper who looks after him. They call him Lonesome. It's a bit of a misnomer because he's got 2 girlfriends with him, been there for 23 years, and they are from Volcan Wolf, which is an area of where saddleback tortoises of different kinds are also found.
So these 2 girlfriends are expected perhaps to produce something that continues the species, or?
Well, after about nearly 30 years of not producing an egg, they have produced eggs in the last couple of years, both of them. As yet, though, they're not getting fertile eggs. George is not a very energetically stud animal compared to some giant tortoises, which really like to enjoy the females for a couple of times before breakfast every day. So you've got a rather reluctant male, and you've got a couple of females that are hybrids of one kind or another. But very interesting stuff is coming to light now, in that this mountain, Volcan Wolf, which is right on the equator, and it's the highest mountain in Galapagos. It has tortoises that have Pinter genes, sometimes 50%. That suggests the animal either has a Pinter mother or a Pinter father, and if we look long enough, we may find them. I spent a couple of weeks there less than a year ago, again with a very energetic team of both mostly Ecuadorians, and we lived on that island and we patrolled it, and we found every possible shape of tortoise. And the ones we found, a third of them had Pinter tortoise genes. So something lives on, some spark lives on, even though we can't show you a pure-blooded Pinter tortoise except for George.
So is your documentary focuses on how the Pinter tortoise fits into the system in the Galapagos today and what might happen if it does reproduce?
Yeah, it's an interesting documentary because it tracks people. People are a very major part of it, and so is Lonesome George. And they're sort of threaded together throughout the entire story. Because Galapagos, a lot of people are surprised to hear that people live there. There are more than 30,000 people live there.
But for those who may not know, tell us approximately where they are located.
These islands are part of the Republic of Ecuador, and they're situated right on the equator, about 600 miles out to sea from the coast of Ecuador, from Guayaquil. So they're tropical, but they're cold. It's a place where you see green turtles and penguins swimming together. So it's full of these extraordinary contradictions. And it's famous because Mr. Darwin was there in the 1830s, and this was one of his major sources of sort of information, as it were, about the whole phenomenon of evolution. So he went home and studied that for the rest of his life.
So in the documentary, what are the main conclusions? What are you trying to explain or propose or underscore?
Well, it's hard to come to conclusions, really. You've got some almost unsolvable things here. You've got one male tortoise. What do you do? Every tourist gets to see him if they want to. But we've got that new wrinkle of the volcan wolf animals that may possibly yield Pinter genes or crossbreed with him and allow the Pinter tortoise to have some kind of a future. The people in Galapagos, I mean, the tourists go there in numbers. In fact, 3 full-size aircraft arrive every day, putting off hundreds and hundreds of tourists. And they have a wonderful time, and they in general are well behaved, and they don't do any harm. But they represent, they're mostly fairly wealthy. It's quite expensive to go to Galapagos. So they have spending power, so people come to the islands to open up little shops or restaurants and businesses of one kind or another to take advantage of the secondary market of the tourists. And so the communities are growing. And they have a constitutional guarantee that an Ecuadorian citizen can live in any part of Ecuador that he likes. So people come out. It's far better to live in Galapagos than to live in an impoverished village in Amazonas or in the high Andes. And that's what they're doing. They can't build the schools fast enough. They can't find fresh water supplies fast enough. Only 3% of the island is accessible for human habitation. 97%, which is actually mostly the drier part, is for nature only. So they're doing their best. But the people pressure is something that hasn't been solved. And we're not sure how it will be solved.
Going back to Lonesome George specifically, how was it that tortoises on this particular island came to be so scarce relative to others where that didn't happen?
Well, it's a fairly small island, and if you are a returning sperm whale ship or something coming back from the far Pacific, it's one of the first islands you'd come to get your tortoises, because that's what the whalers fed upon. Was they filled the bilges, they filled the hull with live tortoises that would stay alive until 6 months later or a year later when they were butchered for fresh meat. So Pinter was one of the first islands they'd come to, and so it got heavily raided. The other thing was that they're giant tortoises, but they're not particularly giant. One man could carry an adult female tortoise on his shoulder. You couldn't do that with Santa Cruz tortoises. They're just too big. And they were found relatively near the sea. And then you had these peculiar hazards of the terrain, where the animals forever at risk of just sliding into a deep crack in Mother Earth and never getting out.
So the explanation is sort of a combination of what happened during one of the earlier phases of globalization and then the dangers of the landscape.
And if you look through the whalers' notebooks in Nantucket archives and so on, you find that they got a lot of turtles on Pinter. Sometimes a couple of hundred on one trip before 1850. 1850 was the break point. After that, they still went to Pinter and they would find not a couple of hundred, but they would get 3 or 2 or 5. And then the scientists said, well, we better get the last ones for our museums before they all get taken by the whalers. So they went later on in the 1880s, 1900, 1905, really wanting prizes of Pinter tortoises, including the famous Lord Rothschild was part of this pressure to get the last ones. And they only found males. So this species was sort of masculinated for the last 150 years of its existence. And finally, one Lonesome George shows up. I mean, it's a bizarre story, and we're not really sure of how it all hangs together.
What was the food supply for the whalers before they came upon this island full of tortoises?
Well, when they came around Cape Horn, they would grab some penguins and sort of mummify them or dry them out for later consumption. And they probably brought some salt pork with them from Massachusetts when they started. But it was...
So the fresh meat was really welcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you think about the turtle and tortoise issue today, where do you feel things are? Are we improving in terms of our conservation efforts? Are we attentive enough to the needs of these creatures? Is it possible to have prosperity and tourism and the preservation of these species?
Well, they have to go together in that if there's nothing for the tourists to see in terms of wildlife, they won't bother coming. And then the economics will change. Galapagos would be very difficult for people to make a living in if there wasn't a fairly well-heeled set of tourists arriving there every day. But where it all goes from here is hard to say. Tourism is a sort of a blessing, but it can quickly become too much of a blessing. And that's what Galapagos is struggling with at the moment, and the world as a whole is struggling with it. It used to be that slaughter of turtles for food was the main stress. And the Western countries, and the US and England, played their share in green turtle soup and things of this kind. Now it's phasing out. In most places, there are places where the consumption of turtles is still rampant, and China is one of them. China at this point has so few turtles left of its own that they import them from a dozen other countries of Eastern and Southeastern Asia. So that is sort of getting resolved gradually. A lot of people in China are now interested in turtles. Books are published for them, glossy books, and these are not books on how to eat turtles. They're books on how to look after turtles in captivity or to study them in the wild. So the protective constituency does exist in virtually every country you could think of, including China. As marine turtles go, it's the incidental take that is now the main problem, as opposed to the deliberate take of animals for food. All kinds of fishing operations accidentally catch turtles, oftentimes drown them before they're pulled up on the deck. So that's sort of the biggest headache right now, is China is still not fully resolved for the freshwater turtle market, and the incidental take continues in the Atlantic and the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
Let me ask you sort of a fun question. It has been said you have the ability to speak to turtles and tortoises. Now, we know they don't speak English, and so I'm gathering you have mimicked some of the sounds they make that causes them to respond. Tell us a little bit about this sort of Dr. Dolittle characteristic.
Well, I don't know if it's communication or just exaltation, but when giant tortoises are courting, the male, as he approaches the female, will give out sounds like just like that. And you can hear him from 100 yards away. And that happens through the mating process, but it doesn't occur at any other time. And the females don't make that sound at all.
So when you, quote, communicate to them, you make noises that suggest you're friendly?
Well, I don't do it a lot. But it's nice to feel a oneness with the animals that you're studying.
That's great. So generally speaking, you are optimistic about the future for turtles and tortoises?
One by one, we're getting little areas of triumph where something which we thought was extinct, we found the last 3 of them or something, and wow, let's breed these. This is happening surprisingly often. But it's uphill all the way. And you're up against the mega issues of the world as opposed to the turtle-sized issues of the world. And some of these may not be solvable.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pritchard, very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Brucia, and we'll see you next time.